Here's something interesting. Even secular historians today affirm that Jesus did miraculous things. Why would that be the case? It's really simple. It's because even in ancient times, it wasn't just the Christians who were saying that Jesus did miraculous things. Jesus' own enemies who wanted to discredit him also affirmed that he did miracles. The debate in ancient times was never whether or not Jesus did miracles, it was by what power he did them. The easiest way to take Jesus down would have been to just say, oh no, he didn't actually do it. Prove that he did it. But they couldn't do that. They could have simply said the healings were made up. The crowds didn't actually gather around him. Storms weren't really calmed. And all of this was just invented after he died to bolster people's story about who he was when he was alive. That never occurs. No one attacks him from that angle until the 20th and the 21st century, 2,000 years after his life and death. Instead, they all simply admitted that he did something and they attributed it to a different source than what the Christians were saying. The Pharisees, the pagans, different philosophers, they said it came from different places like magic, sorcery, or the devil, but they never said Jesus just didn't do it. Why? Because they couldn't. And so before we get into the historical evidence for this, because I'm not just going to make that claim and then stop the video, there's good historical reasons to believe this is the case, we need to talk about how we're going to do this history, because that's always the most important. And in this video particularly, we're going to hone in on the criteria of embarrassment, or another way to put it is the criteria of a testimony against interest. What does it mean to give a testimony against interest? Well, if my mom compliments me and says something nice about me, could be true, could also be false. We'll never know. But if someone who's suing me says that I am an honest person, and even says that I'm honest in a particular category that has something to do with the lawsuit, that is far more likely to be true because that person who's suing me has no good reason to actually say that. And so that person is giving a testimony against their own self-interest. And so the criterion of embarrassment is also this idea of against your own interest. It's an embarrassing fact that you are willingly admitting, and you wouldn't admit it if it weren't true because there's no good reason for you to make it up. And so depending on the situation, it may make more sense to call it the testimony against interest versus the criterion of embarrassment. And you'll see how this plays out here in just a second. There are a lot of different areas where this plays out because it's just human psychology. It makes sense to be able to validate certain claims based on this testimony of against interest or this criteria of embarrassment. And so particularly for this topic, what are we trying to say? If Jesus's followers claim that he did something, okay, fine. They're following him. Of course they'll say that. But what if his enemies say the same thing? Now you have to listen to a lot more because they did not want to affirm anything about Jesus. They wanted to kill Jesus. And if they wanted to kill Jesus, why would they affirm some of these things? So let's look at that. And it starts most readily in Mark chapter 3. It's the earliest and the strongest evidence of what we're talking about right here. So the religious leaders are coming to Jesus. They're trying to explain away his miracles. And they say, hey, yeah, he's doing miraculous things, but he's doing them by the power of Beelzebub, or the prince of demons, the devil, Satan himself. Yeah, Jesus is doing miraculous things, but he's following Satan, so don't listen to him. And this is multiply attested. So this shows up in Mark, shows up in Matthew and Luke, and Matthew and Luke show an independent account of this. And so we're certain that it at least shows up in two independent sources, both Mark and Q. And so we need to sit with this for a second, because on the one hand, you have Christians writing these books. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, right? The Gospels. And they are admitting that the Pharisees are against Jesus, and that the Pharisees believed that Jesus was doing miracles by the power of Satan. If these Christians were wanting to make up stories about Jesus doing miracles, they would never in a million years add to it the fact that the Pharisees opposed Jesus's miracles. The Pharisees are the religious leaders of the time. And so if Christians are trying to convince their fellow Jews to follow Jesus, they would never say, oh, by the way, all of the leaders that you look up to, all of the Pharisees that you respect and you see them as the top authority in religious things, they disagree with Jesus. But you should still follow him. They would never do that. And so the point is, it's not made up. Christians would not have made up the story of the Pharisees rejecting Jesus's miracles if not for the fact that it actually occurred. And so that's step one. Now, historically, we can be pretty certain, there's no such thing as 100% certainty, right? But we can be pretty certain that the Pharisees actually attributed Jesus's miracles to Satan instead of to the power of God. This also confirms that the Pharisees genuinely believed that Jesus was doing miracles. Otherwise, they would have just said, no, you're not. Show us that you're doing miracles, instead of attributing them to a different source. And so you have this criterion of embarrassment, this testimony against interest happening on both sides. The Christians are testifying to something that they would find embarrassing, and the Pharisees are testifying to something that's against their own interest. Yes, Jesus actually did miracles. To them, the miracles were an observable fact, and so they had to reinterpret that observable fact in light of the narrative that they wanted to tell. So that's point number one. And then when we move outside of the New Testament, you have the Talmud, which is kind of, without getting into the weeds of what the Talmud is, it's the tradition that's been passed on in rabbinic circles. We'll just say it this way. It's based on oral tradition, but it's been a development over a few hundred years. So it's dated later. So we don't want to completely just take the Talmud and say, oh, this is what people believed in the first century. But it is still good evidence for what has been believed for the first couple centuries after Jesus' lifetime. And so the Talmud claims that Jesus practiced sorcery and enticed Israel and led them astray. And so again, you have a clear claim that Jesus is doing something supernatural, but he's doing something supernatural from a power other than the God of Israel. And so the power isn't coming from God, it's through sorcery, some kind of demonic force, sorcery, that kind of thing. And so even though the Talmud is late, and we don't know if it's completely independent of the Gospels, or maybe it's a reaction to the Gospels, what we do know is there's consistency, and argument does not live or die by the dating of the Talmud. What we see is consistency in how these Jewish groups who are not Christian are dealing with the claims of Jesus's miracle working. Never once, nowhere do we see in the first few centuries that anyone is claiming that Jesus just didn't do them. That doesn't exist. The narrative is clear that yes, he did something, but it was the wrong source. Now let's go to Celsus. So around 175 AD, Celsus wrote really the first academic work challenging Christian claims about Jesus. And we actually don't have his surviving work at all. Everything that we have comes from Origen's like sentence by sentence refutation of his claims. And so we have almost his entire work because Origen went into great detail in trying to argue for Christianity against Celsus's claims. And so what Celsus claimed was that when Jesus went to Egypt, he learned magic, Egyptian magic, from the Egyptians. He came back and he used it to claim to be divine when really he was just practicing Egyptian magic. And so now you have not just first century Pharisees who are claiming that Jesus was doing things from an evil power, not just later centuries of rabbinic schools claiming that. You also have pagan philosophers who are claiming the exact same thing, that, oh, it was actually a form of magic, a form of pagan magic that he used to trick people. He was actually lying to people and he was using magic and claiming to be God. This is fascinating. This is arguably the most well-educated, academically rigorous response to the Christian claims that have been written up to this time period. And again, he's not saying Jesus didn't do any of this, they made it all up. He's saying, oh, there's other good explanations for it. He got power elsewhere. And then, of course, you have the famous quote from Josephus, and Josephus is more of a neutral observer, little bit hostile, but mostly neutral towards Christianity and towards Jesus. In his most famous quote about Jesus, I have a whole video on whether or not that quote is authentic, and it is authentic. There's just a few touch-up points that Christians touched up, and you can tell. And so if you remove Christian interpolation from it, you've got your base quote from Josephus on who he thought Jesus was. And one of the clear things that he said was he was a wonder worker. He was a miracle worker. He did miraculous things. And so you have this third testimony from a historian who really had no dog in the fight about who Jesus was, saying he did miraculous things. And so depending on whether you call the Talmud an independent source, you have 3 or 4 independent streams all saying that Jesus in fact did miraculous things. And so this is where I actually think we have a better point of view in the 21st century than they did then, because what most people, I won't say everyone, but I think what most people, even in the world, not just in the West, but in the world, would agree is that Jesus was a great man, that the things that he taught us were beautiful, and that arguably the way he lived is a model for how most people should live. His emphasis on love and forgiveness and caring for the poor, caring for the needy, protecting the people who can't protect themselves. Like, oh my word, like those values are deeply embedded in our psyche, in our souls in the West. And 2,000 years ago, that was never the case. It was the strong survive. Philosophical thought in the first century before Christianity stepped on the scene was where you are is just your lot. And there's fairness doesn't really matter. Justice isn't really a thing. Being treated equal, like, no, the universe decides what your lot is in life, and that's just what you get. You just have to suck it up. But Jesus steps on the scene and he totally changes that. And so all I'm saying with this is we have a better grasp of the amazing things that Jesus taught. And so what we know that they didn't know is no, Jesus is not evil. He was not evil, which means his source of power, so to speak, wasn't evil. He didn't do things in the power of Satan. He didn't do sorcery. And we have in modern times we have a different view of sorcery, right? But what they were talking about back then was, yeah, they were evil sources. He was gaining his power due to evil influences. And we would all say that's just not true. Where we stumble then is we say, oh, he did all of these great things. So now we have to just say, well, all those supernatural aspects, he taught great things. He was a great moral teacher. And all those supernatural aspects they were added later by later Christians to kind of bolster the image of who Jesus was. He became larger than life because his teaching was so great. Now we want to add on these supernatural components to make him even more compelling of a person, that more people believe in him and follow his teachings and things like that. It sounds reasonable, right? Adding Jesus's divinity on later sounds reasonable, except the historical evidence does not point in that direction. From the very earliest time, all of these different historical data points point to the fact that Jesus' miracle working and his teaching are intertwined in the earliest historical documents. What we would expect is that if Jesus' divinity and miracle teachings and things like that were added later, we would expect the earliest documents to all show Jesus' moral teaching and love, forgiveness, these sorts of things. And then later manuscripts, later discussions of Jesus, maybe like the Gospel of John would now have, because it was written in like AD 90 or possibly a little later, we would see those have his miracles, but then Mark and Q and these earliest sources wouldn't have any sign of Jesus doing miracles. And what we see is that's not the case at all. Jesus's miraculous deeds, his miracle working is just perfectly intertwined with his moral teachings to the point that you can't separate the two. And that's why modern secular historians affirm that people unanimously agreed in the earliest times during his life that Jesus was a miracle worker. What does that mean today? There's different explanations, but they do agree that that is how Jesus was seen from the very beginning, and that can't be separated out. And just so you know, I'm not making this up historically. So Paul affirms the supernatural aspects of Jesus. His is the earliest of any of our writings. Like a year and a half after Jesus died and rose again, do we have someone say, yeah, Jesus rose again, he's supernatural. Mark is just chock full of miracles. Actually, Mark has more miracles than teaching, arguably, an action gospel, and that's our earliest gospel. So actually, you have to flip your understanding of Jesus on its head compared to the 21st century, where the 21st century says, yeah, Jesus was a good moral teacher, but that supernatural stuff, all made up, added later. Mark is like, no, miracle heavy. And then we've also got some teaching in there. And then John, the latest gospel, has a bunch of teaching and less miracles. That's the exact opposite of what the modern mind thinks of Jesus. Interestingly enough, it's the exact opposite of the historical data. A couple others, the early Acts summaries, the kerygmatic sermon summaries, as scholars call it. Those are dated really early, and those all show Jesus's miraculous deeds, and even Q, which is traditionally understood as a sayings, a hypothetical document or oral teaching that had a bunch of sayings and teachings of Jesus. Even within those, Jesus is talking about his own miracles and how his miracles point to his own messiahship. And so even in the most rudimentary list of teachings of Jesus, there's miraculous built right into the core. Now, there's one major counter argument that people make that is worth bringing up before we wrap this video up. And it's, didn't everyone just believe in miracles in the first century? And so if everyone believed in miracles, then it just makes more sense. It's more expedient to say, oh, he's doing miracles by a different source instead of denying his miracles outright. And I think there's two fatal flaws with this argument. The first being, when the Pharisees are saying that Jesus was using a different source for his miracles, they're actually implicitly affirming that he really did the miracle. And the category of not miracle, like something just being a fake miracle, absolutely existed. So if you look at Deuteronomy 13, 1-3, it's this like true signs, wrong God kind of criteria. It's a test. And the test is, if it leads you astray from God, then it can be a true sign, but a wrong source kind of situation. But the implication is there's a clause in there that says, even if the sign or wonder comes to pass. And that's implying that there's a lot of signs and wonders that don't come to pass. They're just fake. They're false. But even if it does, you can know that it's a false sign by the source of the sign and by the result. Did it lead people closer to God or further away from God? And this is specifically the God of Israel, right? Because it's within the framework of idolatry is what the Old Testament is talking about here. And so this is the exact category, the exact framework that the Pharisees are using to scrutinize Jesus's miracles. By doing so, they're implicitly affirming, we believe that Jesus just did a real sign, but it's leading Israel into idolatry. That's what they're saying. And so by using this criteria, you're saying, okay, yeah, again, the Pharisees believed that Jesus did real miracles. Now, the second thing that we need to talk about is chronological snobbery, which a lot of Christians quote, comes from C.S. Lewis. I think it's a really important point as well. And we always have to bring it up when we're talking about history. And it's like, they just believed that back then. It's a false premise to say that people were stupid back then and we're not stupid now. People fully understood and fully doubted all the time miraculous deeds and instances and things like that. Like, there's plenty of examples just in the New Testament of people doubting. And so that category existed. There is no good reason that they couldn't apply that category to what Jesus was doing, unless it's because it was most plausible that he was actually doing it. But let's look at some examples. The people who demanded signs from Jesus, they were approaching Jesus with a skeptical posture. They were like, hey, Messiah, if you're the Messiah, then show us a sign. Ironically, he had just done a miracle like one chapter before. But in this case, we just see the skeptical posture of people who are saying, hey, I'm not going to believe you unless you show me a sign. Thomas is a famous example. Thomas the doubter, he's like, until I see Jesus myself, until I feel the holes in his hands or in his side, I won't believe that he came back to life. Because that is just a ridiculous claim. No one would believe that someone rose back from the dead bodily. That just doesn't make sense. Mockery at the cross. They were mocking him because they believed, they were like, hey, if you really can do miracles, save yourself from that cross. They heard other people claim during his life that he had been a miracle worker, but they didn't believe. They're like, no, you didn't do it. Come down off the cross if you really did. So there's a posture of skepticism right there. People are people. Whether it's 2,000 years ago or today, people are just looking for the most reasonable explanation. And there were plenty of examples in the New Testament of skeptics because they just hadn't seen him do it. They'd heard other people say it. They hadn't seen it themselves. And lastly, this counter argument, it proves too much, because if everyone in that time was just reflexively, they saw something even remotely miraculous and they just attributed some religious reason to it, most of the time you'd probably see them attributing like ambiguous or unknown source. But instead, across the board, Jesus's enemies are attributing the most negative source that they can think of to his miraculous deeds. And so what does that mean? That means that their arguments and their defenses of why Jesus couldn't be the Son of God, why he couldn't be divine, they're strained and they're defensive. They're not objective. These weren't lazy and generic reasons. They're like, it just could have been that. It could have been this. It's like they had a dog in the fight of why they wanted to disprove Jesus. And so they were making up reasons like magic, sorcery, demonic influence. And they never even reached for, he actually didn't do anything. He made it all up. So they were reaching, but they were reaching for the only possible categories. And in their reaching, in their striving, they're showing that they were straining and they were defensive in their attributions. So what does this mean? So to the skeptic, I would say in the first few centuries, people were reaching to try and disprove Jesus through attributing to him demonic influence or the like. And today, I'll say what I said earlier. We know, most of us, I'm not going to say everyone, there's a lot of people online and on social media, but most of us know that what Jesus taught was good. Like, he taught genuinely good things. And so I would use Jesus's own words to make a plea to you, is that you will know them by their fruit. When someone actually lives their life according to Jesus's standards, not just saying it, but actually doing it, right? There's a big difference. We all know the person who says they're a Christian, but they don't know the first thing about what Jesus actually taught, and they're even further away from implementing what he taught. So I'm completely excluding that category right now. But for the person who listens to Jesus and actually obeys him, we know that they are lights in the world. And so if that's the case, then just take a second look at Jesus. The historical evidence supports the fact that everything in the Gospels about Jesus is true. Not that his divinity was later added on to good moral teachings. It's actually the opposite. It's that his moral teachings and his divine status and his underworking are so tightly integrated that if you try and remove one piece of Jesus, you actually remove all of him. And so if you're someone who does respect and appreciate what Jesus taught, then maybe you should just take a second look. And even if you don't become a Christian, at the very least, when you start reading the Gospels again, he becomes a lot more interesting character. Because what we like to do is we open the Bible, we read Mark, we read John, and we hit the miracles and we're like, whatever, that's not for me today. Let's just get on to the teaching. That's not how Jesus viewed himself. He viewed his miracles as much of a message as were his words. In fact, even more so, because he said, I'm not just going to talk the talk, I'm going to walk the walk. I'm going to actually do what I preach. And he brought the kingdom of God. And part of the kingdom of God was restoration of the natural world and healing sick and calming the storms and even calming our inner storm and our psychological issues. So take another look at Jesus is what I would recommend. Take a full look on him and don't ignore the things that you think are our modern sensibilities can't handle, because Jesus becomes a lot more interesting of a person when you don't do that. And to the Christian, I would say something similar is that when we read the gospel stories, oftentimes we do the same thing. We say, okay, yeah, these miracles were cool and they proved that he was the Messiah, but let's get on to the teaching so that I can live my life. And I do genuinely think that Jesus had just as much to teach us from his miracles as he did from his words, and that those cannot be separated. And so see how those interact with each other. See how are the miracles supporting what he taught, and how are the words pointing back towards his miracles? Of course, the ultimate miracle is the resurrection and the hope that we will one day rise with him. But every single miracle is synonymously proof of his messiahship, but also a message for you today, just like his words are. His words were for those then, and they're for you now. And so I don't want us to skip over that anymore, like we have in the past. I want us to read that as if it is the most relevant thing for my life today, because it really is. Every word in the Bible is inspired and is for our benefit, not just the teaching passages, but also the miraculous ones. So that's all I've got today. Hope you enjoyed it. If you did, consider sharing it with someone else. Specifically, if someone doesn't believe that Jesus's miracles were historical, you could send it their way, and it's really encouraging to me. It helps me keep going and putting out more videos like this. So thanks for your time, and we'll see you in the next one. Peace.